larger picture here. If men knew what power really was, we wouldn't do the things that the society needed to do to protect ourselves. If we really understood that going to war and dying was about powerlessness, not power, then fewer men would go to war, and we wouldn't be here talking now. It has been always functional for societies to keep men disconnected from themselves. That every society that existed for the long term, existed based on its capacity to train its males to be disposable and to call it power, which is an incredible statement. And the exceptions...
I'm with stupid.
Yeah, what's that?
I'm with stupid.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of... Yeah.
And now, there's exceptions to that rule, and the exceptions are almost all societies that were isolated, that had abundant amounts of water, abundant amounts of food, and were isolated from attack. But as the world became easier to create transportation, and those societies were discovered, those societies were usually overrun by people that had the ability to get that food and get that water, get those resources. So that's the larger dilemma of masculinity, and it's the dilemma. So let's look at that in very practical terms again. Firefighters, most communities that are small communities in this country have their firefighters are paid what? They're called volunteer firefighters. And if men learn to, and most of those men are what? Liberals or conservatives? Conservatives. You never want to trust a liberal to save you from a fire. The higher up the scale you go, the more integral thinking the more you value yourself. You know, I don't want another Kerry supporter out there when I'm there in the fire. I want a man who hasn't thought about what he's doing to come in there and save me and my wife and my kids. So being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also quite serious in many respects. Now the point behind that, the deeper point behind that, is that the volunteer firefighter who learned to die without question to save a stranger at the expense of himself was somebody who never learned to question. That person is functional for the community existing without having to pay firefighters and to having lower taxes in that community, etc. And if we had to pay only females to do that, there's no way, shape, or form there would be volunteer firefighters of all females across the country. Our houses would cost us, if we had to have 50% females building our homes and involved in all the construction process, the lumberjacks had to be 50% females, the truckers to bring the lumber to the home had to be 50% females. If you had all that to be 50% females, quadruple at least the cost of your home. Women wouldn't at 50% levels be willing to die for that low a cost. And so it was functional to get men to think of themselves as saviors, as heroes. Those are the bribes that got us to distract ourselves from our personal power, to do things that empowered the society to save itself rather than the person to save him or herself.
Which would be appropriate in certain circumstances, though.
That's totally appropriate for the benefit of the society up to a point. Yeah. And but it also is because everything that we learned, in my opinion, everything that we learned that was functional for our evolutionary development for millions of years has become dysfunctional in an evolutionary instant. That is, all the things that we learned to kill the people that were criticizing us for survival of the fittest, to kill them in war, now with nuclear technology has the chance of wiping out the entire species. And so suddenly we have to think in a totally different way.
And let me footnote that too, because one of the interesting things we learned from developmental studies, and I want to come back to it's a good point, and I think Warren covered some of the issues, and I'd like to follow up with it briefly. Part of what we learned from developmental studies, and we talked a little bit about interior stages that go from archaic to magic to mythic to mental to rational to integral, or we also think about them as tribal to traditional to modern to postmodern to integral or informational, is that societies don't just move through them and they're at one stage and then all the others are gone. Everybody's born at square one. everybody goes through these stages. Individuals go through these stages. And so they're still present with us. So there really are people moving through the egocentric stages into the traditional conformist, ethnocentric blue that we talked about that George Bush happens to represent, and that's fine. But at each of these stages, those kinds of attitudes that were appropriate are still in those stages. So somebody going through blue, and this is true whether it's in China or in Muslim countries or in Mexico or in Southern Baptists, the fundamentalist mentality of that stage tends to polarize the sexes. That just tends to be an attitude that you find very common around cultures, which is that there's a very defined role for men and women. It's usually defined by whatever the book that's being believed in, the Quran, the Bible, and so on. And at that time, again, 10,000 years ago, that could have been appropriate. It's not appropriate now for people at higher stages. But people moving through these stages are uncomfortable often if you start messing with some of these values and these categories. So part of what becomes more complex if you're taking an integral approach to this is also to find out basically what developmental wave or unfolding people are at, because they're going to have a different attitude to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And you have to, in a certain sense, be able to respect it. It's not a put down to say that somebody's at this stage or that stage of development. Because as far as I can tell, these stages go on just forever. And no matter how high you think you are, there's somebody up there looking down on you having a chuckle. So it's not some way to sit on top of the hierarchy and aren't we swell. It's just to say it's a means of compassionate understanding and perspective taking and skillful means to say, if somebody is at red, they are going to tend to have. Now remember, this is just a tendency. There are other things, the other quadrants that can override it. They're going to tend to have this view of the relation between men and women. And somebody at blue or mythic membership is going to have this. By the time you get to orange, it's much more a meritocracy. We'll pay a woman exactly what we'll pay a man if she can do the same kind of work. And by the time you get to postmodernism, then there's an extreme sensitivity to marginalization. And this just comes with the territory. And then you are hypersensitive to people being excluded. And again, that could be very healthy. It was responsible for the civil rights movement. It's responsible for this whole concern for equal pay for equal work and so on. So those two, to me, that's interesting. Is that so? But what we're talking about now is that as you yourself move into wider, deeper, higher, more encompassing stages of care and consciousness and concern, then your sexual roles are going to shift. Now, what we generally find is that there are more degrees of freedom the more you develop.
You are listening to www.integralnaked.org.